Hi, this is Rob Vanstone from Zebia Labs. What I'm about to show you is a very quick way to set up XLDeploy so that you can deploy a web application to a Tomcat instance that you may have installed locally or on a remote server. It's designed just to show you some of the basic operations within XLDeploy that will allow you to configure an application in such a way that we can build it once and then drop it onto any particular environment. The components we'll install are very straightforward. We're going to have a WAR file for Tomcat. We're going to have a database script or two. We're also going to configure a data source within the Tomcat server itself. They're the three components that I'm going to be deploying. It assumes you've already got an instance provisioned, and therefore what XLDeploy is doing is layering the application across your infrastructure. And that's the sweet spot of XLDeploy. There are obviously ways of creating that infrastructure, registering them in XLDeploy, and we can discuss this in future demos. So a few bits of information I'm going to need. I've got an instance installed on my local machine. This is a Unix-based machine. It's actually a Mac, and there's a few pieces of information I'm going to want from this. Within the bin directory of the Tomcat instance are things to help me administer it, like starting and shutting down. So we'll talk about those a bit later, but it's important to note that if you're familiar with the technology, you can model the various aspects of that within XLDeploy. And this doesn't just relate to Tomcat, but any of the plugins that you install have this concept. You're modeling your application and you're modeling your infrastructure. Why we do that will become apparent shortly. So I've got XLDeploy running. I'm running it in a command shell so that I can stop and start it at will. You may run this as a service in an implementation, but this is quite convenient for me to engineer a solution. I've installed my license and I've logged into the server. If I look at my infrastructure, my applications, there's nothing in here at the moment, and we'll talk about these concepts. But we've kept it as simple as possible. We model an application, we model the infrastructure our applications reside on, and environments are just collections of infrastructure. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually model the connection without using an agent to my piece of infrastructure. In this case, we're going to have the server that we run Tomcat on, which could be on Windows, it could be on Unix, it could be on a variety of platforms. It may be in the DMZ and we can only access it via another box. So there's lots of options here. We'll pick SSH host, it's the most common. We'll give it a name. So we're going to say this is a local server. I've already done this in preparation. And we're going to say the operating system and how we connect. So 192.168.0.18. I've actually enabled remote access, and I have a user and a super secret password. Encrypted and masked. We treat passwords very sensitively, obviously, for obvious reasons, and you don't even need to specify this up front. If you have a tool already, it is possible to configure XLDeploy to pull passwords before a deployment, if that's a use case that really matters. But we look after your secrets equally well, and I think if you've got lots of infrastructure, you could store this within our infrastructure node. That's all I really need for a server. There's loads of other options that allow fairly exotic ways of communicating, often related to security, but right now we're going to just connect simply. And we're going to check that we can connect to that environment. And really straightforward, we check if we can deploy files and we can execute commands. And that's the basis of typically most deployments on physical infrastructure. Okay, so we've checked our connection. We can connect to this server. We don't actually, unless we're copying files or running commands, we don't actually really care about the server. It's just a means to an end, because on that server, our plugins can supply a bunch of containers that we may want to actually deploy to. In this case, I haven't got many plugins installed. I'm going to deploy to Tomcat, and I'm going to create the necessary infrastructure to connect to my Tomcat server. Name it such. that home directory we spoke about, and also some of the admin scripts which we may want to execute when we're doing various tasks. So we have a startup, and this is just allows you to override these scripts. You may have your own scripts that do something with monitoring and so on. You can just call those scripts as you wish. As long as they finish with a reasonable exit code, these will execute fine. We provide a bunch of ways to check the status of Tomcat. We have an example in the comments here, which will be sufficient for our purposes. And we'll just use the Unix one. We also show a way of doing this in Windows. And then we have some wait times, which if we've got a large installation and it takes a while to shut down or start up, we can experiment with these numbers to make deployments more reliable and more successful. So we've got our Tomcat server, and we can check the status. So we can check the status of our Tomcat server. And again, this will run what we call a control task, and you can write your own control tasks. And that will ascertain what state the server's in, and we can do things like stop it. Execute. And we could indeed start it, which we will do. We can check the logs, and that's really verified that everything's good with our configuration, if nothing else. It may be an admin task you perform later on. And again, we don't actually deploy to the Tomcat server itself many of the objects. What we do is deploy to the virtual host. So if we have a new virtual host and leave the defaults, give it a name. We could have specified any app base here. We could have chosen different host names if we wanted to disassociate these, but we've saved that. So now we've got our infrastructure set up. All of that I've done through the UI, could have been driven through our command line interface. We have Puppet modules for doing this. We have a REST API, so you can actually manage this however you see fit. Okay, the environment, and I've mentioned this before, is a collection of infrastructure. So we'll create a new environment. We'll call this one local. So we'll give it a name. And we'll put the infrastructure that we may want to deploy to in this. So I've got a Tomcat server. My WAR files will go to a Tomcat virtual host, and we can save that. I'll come back to dictionaries. You'll see why in a moment. So we have an environment. Now, if we had a production environment with many more instances of this, you can see how grouping these will be useful. Because what we want to do with XL deploy is have the conversation of deployment of saying, make this environment version X of my app. As simple as that. That way, any tool that connects to XL deploy, such as our other product, XL release, or Jenkins, or Bamboo, or TFS, can have that equally simple conversation. Even the ops team in the operations department, if you have one, can receive that simple instruction rather than a lengthy Word document. And the reason why we can keep it simple is the way we model our applications. So let's create a new application. Let's give it a name. And this is just a container for all the different versions of the applications we might have. There's some other settings that you can apply here, and pipelines are something like where you specify the servers this can go to and start to manage the workflow of that. It really is a small aspect of a release. We won't use that today. We'll just speak about deploying our application. So within the application, we create the versions of our components. This is something we typically do using build or CI tools like Maven, TeamCity, Jenkins, Bamboo, TFS. All of these deliver versioned packages to XL Deploy for deployment, and we're going to create it through the UI. So we're going to click on the context menu, new deployment package, and we'll give it a name. As I said, this is typically a version number, and if you are using semantic versioning, you can then start to make applications dependent on each other. That's an advanced task which we can talk about later on. So I've got version 1. I'm not going to specify any information here, but there's a whole host of things that may affect the way our application is orchestrated, or what dependencies we have. We'll keep it vanilla for the time being. And now this is a versioned package, and version 1 of our application is going to contain our original WAR file, which is typically compiled and built. It's going to contain our database scripts, which might be our initial settings, and it's going to contain possibly configuration of our app server, maybe even of our web server, but that is something we might leave till later. The way we do that is the same. We're going to create a new, and our plugins supply all of the types of things that you might want to deploy. You've probably noticed that everything in XL Deploy is a type, and it's that unified deployment model, which is what we call it, which is what UDM stands for. It's that type system that gives a whole host of benefits a bit later on. So the first thing we're going to add is our WAR file, and our WAR file is called Pet Clinic, and we search for it. So we might have it in an artifact repository, in which case we can specify Maven coordinates. Mine's on my local file system, and I'm going to upload it. Now, we operate a build once deploy anywhere paradigm, which means there may be environmental differences within our packages that we want to change at deploy time to suit a particular environment. Things like database credentials, URLs, sometimes ports, various application or environment specific things that we want to change. So to do that, we represent them with placeholders. And I know that my particular WAR file already has some placeholders set up in it. If you know it doesn't, then you don't need to click this button. But if it does, scanning placeholders will look through the file on import and retrieve all of the things that are placeholders. So that when I click save, you'll notice that we have found some, and they're the ones that I've already mentioned that I was expecting. And that will be important because we'll want those to be in our dictionary if we do this time after time. It may be that you don't want to put them in a dictionary. You want your users to fill them in every time. I wouldn't recommend it, but it is possible, and XL Deploy can handle both scenarios. So that's our WAR file. There it is. It's in our package. It's a zip file containing a manifest describing everything in, and any binary artifacts if you physically locate them here. What I will do is also add my SQL scripts. In this case, I've written some scripts in my home directory. I will browse those, and I've actually zipped them up. So if you're doing this manually, it's something that you just have to recognize. You need a folder containing some scripts, and I'll show you these scripts in a moment, and you need to zip them up. Our plugins for the CI tools do this for you. So you just need to point your CI tool at the folder location, and it will automatically add the artifact to XL Deploy. XL Deploy needs a physical artifact. So here I have that folder set up. That's what we're going to load. You'll notice again that placeholders, and that I don't think there are any now in this file, is ticked, but if there were, we would discover them, and I will add my component. Okay, so we've got our database script, and we've got our WAR file, and that might be enough to do a deployment. I know in this case it's not, so now we need to set up our data source, because we've set up a data source in Tomcat, or we will do, to point to our SQL database. What we're going to do now is add a data source to our application. So if you want to configure the different data sources in your different environments, you can do this. You'll notice this is yet another type in Tomcat among the many things we can configure in Tomcat. So here we have a data source and we're going to give it a name. A context. All of these properties are what you'd expect to fill in for your data source. Our class name. I think that would be that. Our URL. Usernames and passwords, so we might have now this is a pro tip. Because we mask passwords, sometimes that can be slightly inconvenient. So if you want to see what you're typing, put it in a visible field and then paste it in. There are other properties. If you know your Tomcat data sources, you'll know the types of things you want to configure here, but we'll save it now as it is. So we've now got Pet Clinic WAR file, data source, and our SQL scripts. And that's what our application needs to stand up. These are all the dependent components for my application. In version 2, a bit later on, we may change one or two things about this. Right, so we've got our application, we've got our infrastructure, we have got an environment, but what we didn't add to our environment was the concept of a dictionary. So very quickly, a dictionary is just key value pairs of the things that you've configured as placeholders. So I'm going to relate this to my environment just from a naming perspective, and I'm going to add the different entries. So I've got a jdbc.username, which I will give the value of Rob. I've actually got a jdbc.password, which I will give the value of some super secret password. I'll add both of those. I've also got a jdbc.url, which I realize now I have pasted in the value directly into my data source. So we're going to go and change that in a moment. Sometimes these things happen. But here is the value in the dictionary. And I will save this once I've added that. So anywhere these are found in our application or otherwise, they will be replaced before we do a deployment. So let's save that, and importantly, let's add that dictionary to my environment here and save that. Okay, we've nearly got all the components set up. I've left one out deliberately, and we will add it in a moment. But here is our application. I'm just going to fix that data source so that we can use our placeholder jdbc.url, which might very well be something that differs between environments, and we will save that. So that's our application at version 1. Now what we want to do is deploy that app, and this is typically where you would use as an operator XL deploy. So those small bits of configuration that's probably taken us about 20 minutes just to figure out and add these applications, the future versions will be much more straightforward. We want to deploy. So when we use the context menu to click deploy, you'll notice we have our environment available. We will continue. You can see that a couple of things here of importance. You'll notice that In fact, our Tomcat server isn't really necessary in this environment at the moment. We haven't got a component that needs to go there. That's fine. You'll also notice that we neglected to provide a component for our SQL scripts. So they are unmapped. There is no mapping for those. Our other components have mapped successfully to our Tomcat server. And in fact, that should allow us to do a deployment. And it's worth knowing that at this point in time, things like our data source, if we double click that, have actually had their usernames and passwords and URLs retrieved from the dictionary and replaced. So even now, before touching the target infrastructure, I have the ability to check these values for this environment. Over time, you'll become confident that all you need to do is make sure your dictionaries are up to date and correct and the correct versions being used, and that's something we can talk about later on. And I could execute this deployment. I'm actually quite interested to see what will happen given that we haven't got our database scripts. So let's click on deploy. Really, from an operational perspective, I'm just trying to show now that we have a bunch of activities that will happen. You'll see that these are all related to the Tomcat technology. We haven't deployed our database, and we'll see the result of that. We can check the logs from the Tomcat server as those actual things have been created. So you can see that we've added data source, and we've created the application, and we've started Tomcat. You can see it's was in a stop state, but now it's started, and we're waiting, and then we've completed the deployment. So that's the deployment. And if I actually go and look at my Tomcat server, let's finish this. And let's go to another URL. Let's make sure we've got our app up and running. You can see that we actually have our application. You can see that we actually don't have any of our database stuff in here. So our application isn't complete. And that is because we've already noticed that we didn't deploy our SQL scripts. So this was really designed to just show you that yes, you don't necessarily get this right first time, but no problem, we've got a partial deployment done. What we need to do in the interim is actually create some more infrastructure. So I will do that. So on the Tomcat server, I will add a container for our database. So we'll go to SQL. It's a MySQL client. We'll give it a name. So we'll call it our Pet Clinic database. We'll give it some settings. How do we connect? We're going to connect as root actually in this case. And where is MySQL installed? So MySQL is installed here, and my database name is here, and we'll save that. What we'll do is add that piece of infrastructure to our environment so that it can be targeted. There it is, and we'll save that. And now we can go back to our application and do the deployment. So we'll redeploy version 1 of our app. And this isn't a normal flow, but this is just to show you that XL Deploy does delta deployment. It already knows that it's deployed these two, and all it needs to do this time is actually deploy the database. So if we preview, you'll see that all that's left for us to do is run that, because all of these are already, XL Deploy knows they've been deployed. So we'll execute. And if our scripts are successful, they'll work. You'll notice that the way the plugin is operating at the moment, we're getting the normal MySQL warning, but we'll have masked that in any of the logs anyway. and the shell for the command line is not visible. So we can finish that and move on to the next phase. So let's refresh, and you can see that we've got some veterinarians, we've got the table structure now, but there's no data. And that's what version 2 is going to have. So how do we make version 2? Well, all I'm going to add is an additional SQL script. This is really the final bit of workflow I'm going to show you, because what I'm keen for you to do is model your own applications. But an easy way to do this in the UI, and remember your CI tool just does this as its bread and butter, creating new versions, but we will duplicate the resource, we will rename it, and we will give it a new version number. Rename 2. And we're going to leave alone the data source and the actual WAR file, but we are going to remove this. Yes. Now what I've got in my home directory is the folder db scripts, and I'm going to copy in O2 initial data. So now you can see within db scripts we've got our original create schema, and it's worth noting for this particular database plugin you can also supply a rollback script to undo the changes you've made. So you'll see in our initial data we've got a whole bunch of inserts. Now what I could do for my rollback is add in a whole load of delete statements to delete the values from each of our tables. This is version 1. I'm not going to do that for this, but if you want to create a rollback script to undo the changes, I did an example for the creation of the schema. It's the same name script with the word rollback, and that one drops the tables, whereas the actual update script, it added them. Best practice is to create a rollback script for every change you make. And for the purposes of this demo, just to keep it short, I won't do that. Okay, so now all I need to do is zip up zip, add these two. You'll see it's updated and added those. That's interesting. We'll see what happens with this file now. So I've now got my script. I just need to add again to my version 2 package my new SQL scripts. Give it a name. It's important to keep the name the same, which your CI tool won't have a problem with, but humans may, and you find your script. Interestingly, you can override the credentials provided by the infrastructure. So if you want your applications to connect as a different user to do their updates, you remember I used root in the past. I will use my user. In fact, I can use my placeholders. To do this. Okay, so again, if we want to do a deployment to that environment, we can see everything got mapped, but when we look at the preview, you'll see that the only thing that's changed is the second script. The checksums for the other scripts match, so when we zipped up that file and those files, they haven't changed, they've got the same checksum, so we don't need to add those. If we'd made a modification, they would have been added automatically. So that's something to be aware of. It's a feature of the plugin. You can turn it off if you wish. So we've now got our new script which we can deploy. We can see that we've applied that script, and if we go to our application and do that search, we've now got data. We've got owners, we've got veterinarians. So our application for version 1.02 is complete. Now that's the end of the demo. It's worth noting that we have a bunch of reports that can show you what's been done. This is an area that we're working on. You can see that we've done updates. We can go back to our logs. We can go back to our task monitor. Actually finish this deployment. That's important actually. If you're looking at reports, it only shows deployments that you've finished, because until you finish them, you have the ability to roll them back. But we can look at the logs for a particular application and see what happened during that deployment. Hopefully this was useful, and get back to me at rvanstone@zebialabs.com if you want to continue this discussion.